Hello. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this today. I'll give this a few more minutes, maybe 2 minutes, and then I'll start. Just waiting for a few more people to come in. Maybe just give it another minute, and then we'll make a start. Yeah. Okay. I think that's enough time, and then if more people join, that's perfect. So welcome again, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, hosted by Agricarbon. Title is Net Zero in the dairy sector, and the most important bit of it is get there faster by storing carbon in the soil. So my name is Kamilaris, and I work as a senior business development consultant in Agricarbon, and I'll help chair this meeting, this webinar today. Now, hope you can all see my screen. We have a really exciting lineup of speakers today. First, I'll introduce myself a bit. So I have a background in animal science. I work a lot in modeling greenhouse gas emissions in various different food systems. I've worked with one of the top farm greenhouse gas calculators in the UK, and I led the sustainability agenda for CL before joining Agricarbon as a senior business development consultant. Now, we have, as I said, a really exciting lineup of speakers today, and I'll give you a taste of what's to follow. I'll walk you through a bit of the key topics, but first I'll introduce. So we have Helena Black, our chief scientist here at Agricarbon. She also works at the James Hutton Institute. So she is a world-renowned soil science expert with more than 28 years of experience. She's an honorary research associate for the James Hutton Institute, focusing mainly on measuring, monitoring, managing, and predicting soil's contributions to social, economic, and environmental benefits. She's also a past president of the British Society of Soil Science, and she currently serves as the UN's FAO-supported Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soil. So thank you, Helena, for joining us. Second, we have Mark Brooking. So thank you very much, actually, Mark, for joining today. So he is the Chief Impact Officer at First Milk. He's a leader in the food industry with a focus on socially responsible production systems. Now, with over 2 decades of experience, he has held various technical and commercial roles, demonstrating a commitment to sustainable and regenerative practices. Now, at First Milk, he has been instrumental in advancing the regenerative agriculture and animal welfare agenda and initiatives. And he also owns and operates a diversified farming business down in South Devon. So thank you, Mark, for joining today. We also have very exciting to have you here, Sophia Bithi. She is an environmental scientist. She has been working for Leeds, for the University of Leeds, and now she has moved to the famous Institute for Agroecology at Aarhus University in Denmark. And her interest lies in terms of research falls within agroecology. She's also interested in soil properties and sustainable management systems, soil organic carbon stock estimation, agri-environment schemes, and their impact and uptake and farmland biodiversity. Now, very, very excited to have you all here. Also, just to note that from Agricarbon side, we are very lucky to have with us Eileen Rutter, who is our Business Development and Marketing Director, and of course our founder and CEO, Annie Leeson. So they are both here to help us with your questions in the chat. So one thing to remind you before we start, if you have any questions during the presentation, please put it in the chat. And again, I want to acknowledge my colleague, Rob Reed, who is responsible of putting everything together, and he will help moderate your questions. So very exciting lineup. First of all, there are some key topics that during this presentation we will try to address. First of all, what is soil carbon and why does it actually matter? Then a really, really important question: has permanent grasslands reached their limit, or can they sequester more carbon? Also, how do we recognize the potential of soils to store more carbon? These are all burning questions at the moment in the industry. What are the advantages of direct soil sampling? And the most important thing, what is, if there's any, and I'm sure you found out that there is a RAS, right? So we'll try to highlight the importance of establishing a carbon baseline now, whereas before integrating any practices that would store more carbon, it's very important to establish a baseline. So thank you again all for joining. I'll start my presentation with this triptych of the current situation in net zero in the context of the dairy industry. First of all, what is the challenge, what is the opportunity, and what is the solution? In terms of the challenge, everybody here understands that the pressure that the dairy industry is under, always under in the spotlight to reach environmental targets, to hit net zero, and it has been identified as a really important source of greenhouse gas emissions linked to global warming and climate change. So constantly under the spotlight, even though cattle provide a major benefit to the world, there's been many concerns around the farming systems that we have at the moment, and there's many voices that are calling dairy to scale back to meet climate targets. Now, within this challenge, there lies an opportunity, right? And this opportunity is right under our feet, and it is about soil and how we manage land, right? So I will talk a bit about the role of soil carbon in the dairy industry and how it is a critical piece of natural climate solutions for both arable and grassland. And the opportunity is around soil health, so improving soil health, that's one bit, very important, and carbon removal, so taking carbon from the atmosphere and storing it into the soil. And how we can do that, there's two major strategies. One is around potential practices to increase the carbon sequestered in soils. And the second bit is by managing sustainably the land so that the carbon release is decreased. Now, within this opportunity, the solution is understanding and improving the carbon stored in soil. So when I say understanding, I'm talking about a baseline, and improving, it is about making an impact. Now, in order to do that, what you will need is robust and auditable data in order to measure and monitor progress. And I'll walk you through later in the presentation, what does it actually mean to have robust and auditable data. First thing to understand is that this data, right, needs to be accurate and high integrity in order to be able to back the claims and prove change. Second bit is it needs to be cost effective, right? So it needs to make financial sense for the stakeholders. And last but not least, it needs to be scalable, so across diverse landscapes and land practices, and it needs to be future-proof. Now, right. Within this opportunity now, there is a bit of understanding on what is the role of soil carbon in the food system, in our food systems. And main question is how soil actually stores carbon, right? So I know this is a bit kind of like taking it back to the basics, but it's really important to understand that this is a natural process. This is a biophysical process. So it's a very simplified version, but long story short, plants absorb CO2 from the air, from the atmosphere, to have it in their biomass, so encapsulate in their biomass. Some of it goes down the roots. There, within very complex processes and interactions with other microorganisms, we have soil organic carbon, which a part of it stays is stored in the soil, and a part of it is released back into the atmosphere as CO2. So the main target would be to increase this rate of sequestering, so storing more carbon into the soil, so taking carbon from the atmosphere, storing it into the soils. Now, why this is important? This is important as a climate mitigation strategy, right? So we can have carbon removed from the atmosphere. And right here, I think there needs to be a distinction between, because you've heard many terms like carbon removals or carbon reductions or net zero sequestration. We are now talking about carbon removal. So carbon reductions would be, they're distinct mitigation strategies. So carbon reductions would be, for example, enhanced energy efficiency, or looking at low emission technologies. This would be reducing the current amount of emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We are talking about carbon removal. So we are talking about removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it into the soil. And there's a huge potential to do that. If you look at the annual global sequestration potential, when you look at the soils, this is huge, and it could be from 2.5 to 8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is significant annual global sequestration potential. Now, apart from that, there's also, apart from the climate mitigation, there's also co-benefits. And so it's part of the story. The other part of the story has to do with soil health. So we have increased soil health if you increase the soil carbon. Increased biodiversity and increased yields by creating reservoirs of nutrients for plant productivity. So many co-benefits. The other co-benefit is building resilient systems, right? So reduce soil erosion with increased soil carbon, reduce runoff and risk of flooding, as well as increased soil water holding capacity and drought resilience. So looking at the role of soil carbon, there's these three things that work synergistically together when you look at the whole picture. Now, this is all nice and well, but how can we actually, and are there any strategies that actually increase the soil carbon, the carbon in the soil? Now, you've all heard the term of regenerative agriculture, regen ag as it called. I've put it here because these are strategies that can help with increasing the amount of carbon in the soil. And when you talk about roots in agriculture, there's 5 key principles. And I used this really nice graph from Groundswell here, which is in a few days. 5 key principles include diversity, so increasing the diversity by different strategies like rotation layers or companion cropping. Second bit is livestock integration, so integrating livestock and arable systems through different strategies like long recovery periods and different grazing regimes. Then minimizing soil disturbance with, for example, no-till agriculture. Maintain living roots. And this is very important because it has to do with carbon capture in the roots and in the soil. And then protect soil surface. So use cover cropping and similar strategies. Now, these 5 principles will result to healthier soil. So put soil in the middle of the system. Healthier soils leads to healthier plants, healthier animals, and healthier people. So it's a circle, and it's not a new concept. I think this needs to be highlighted. This is not a new concept. It is a new buzzword, right? It is a new term, Reeds and Ag, but it's not a new concept. It is all about improving soil health and fertility while protecting precious resources like water resources and biodiversity. And to the point that this is not a new concept, the thing that we need to keep in mind is that some farmers, if not most of the farmers, are already doing it, right? So what we are having here is we need a way to be able to prove that this impact is real and is happening. And this is why we are focused on the need for direct soil sampling. Now, what I mean by that is that we need a way to be able to manage the actual impact. So why do we need direct soil sampling? So first of all, there's high spatial soil variation, right? So what you especially for the UK or for Europe, what you have is a lot of different soil types, even within one field, right? And when you translate this to soil carbon stocks, right, you can have anything from 40 tons of carbon per hectare to 200, right? So there's a huge soil variation, and that reinforces the need to be accurate, so to be able to measure this accurately. Second thing why you need direct soil sampling is what we're trying to capture here, right, is a small percentage of change over time. And don't get me wrong, it's not a small change. So when you add fields, when you add farms, when you add the whole portfolio, it's a huge change, right? And it makes a huge impact. But when it comes to detecting the percentage of change, it's very small. So for example, if we look at detecting adding, let's say, 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year, right, which is a bulk, an average number for region practices in the literature. So if you want to add this after 5 years, we're talking about 5 tons of carbon per hectare. And for a field that has, let's say, 100 when it comes to soil carbon stocks, we're trying to detect a change as small as 5%. So this fact again reinforces the need for accuracy. And then the last bit is that this change that we have captured needs to be statistically significant change. And this comes from all the major methodologies and all the major organizations. Statistically significant change means there's no noise, means that this is real, right? So try to imagine high spatial soil variation, small percentage of change over time, and it needs to be statistically significant. This is why we have developed a very, very, very specific process that acknowledges all of these issues and all of these realities in order to be able to to prove change. So you need an accurate, an adequate number of samples, of direct soil samples, in order to be able to prove real change. Now, I said we and not many times. So who are we, right? So building this process, Agricarbon, as I said, we can accurately. This comes to the previous issues that I described, and robustly measure the amount of carbon in the soil. And we do this, and I'll explain why and how, cost effectively and at scale. So we use direct soil sampling. We provide accurate data that underpin the confidence when you report environmental targets. And this in turn unlocks this global transition to regenerative farming and healthier planet. Now, these are just a few companies that we work with, and I say trusted by. And the main thing to get out of it is that these companies get the need for accuracy, and they get the need for direct soil sampling in order to be able to have the confidence to report on their progress and their targets. Now, how do we actually do that? How do we actually unlock this direct measurement at scale? Now, what I have here is this 4-step process, very straightforward. It starts with formulating the sampling strategy, right? And we have a team working on answering 2 questions, right? How many samples do we need, and where do we need to sample? This leads to an adaptable, optimized sampling design, which is specifically tailored to detect change in the carbon, to detect change in carbon in the soils. So we use just enough number of samples to give you the confidence that this is a measurable real change. After the sampling strategy, the real fun begins. So we go out there with our field operators and our ATVs, and we collect the samples. So we have developed the system of rapid and very flexible georeferenced field sampling. We go up to 1 meter in depth, and we extract intact soil cores. And you will hear more about the reason why we choose to go deeper than actually a lot of the companies and a lot of the models. And after that, so after we collect the cores, we send them back to our lab in Dundee, Scotland, where the actual magic happened. So here we have our automated analysis. Now, this was inconceivable 5 years ago, right? To be able to offer this solution at a scale and at this price. So what we have managed to do with, putting together a lot of innovation, a lot of robotics, a lot of automated processes, we have managed to not only increase the accuracy and the confidence in the results, and this is something that we can prove because we have been part of a comparison with different labs in Europe and the UK. But we are able to offer this at a lower cost because we can do hundreds of samples per day. Now, what we do is we're only focused in analyzing 2 things. So soil carbon content and bulk density measured for each sample. We use the latest scientific methodologies, so elemental analysis with dry combustion to measure the soil organic carbon, and we measure bulk density for each sample. We don't use any regional, not even field averages, because these are the 2 most important figures when you want to look at the soil carbon stocks with as little uncertainty as possible. And now after that, it comes a very easy to follow report, which is compliant with the latest reporting standards. Now, I've walked you through our process, and I think it would be interesting to look at how is this actually applied into a real world context. So, Mark, can you talk us a bit through your experience with working together with us with First Milk?
Yeah, by all means, such as thank you very much, Harry, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So, yes, I work for First Milk actually, as you can imagine, as the name says, we're a farmers cooperative. I've just put a map up, actually, just showing you the sort of like location of our farms. I mean, in essence, actually, you can see they're on the western side of the country. They're sort of typical mixed family farms, 177 hectares, as you can tell from the number of cows, not massively overstocked, which is but as I say, productive actually dairy farms. Most of them would have actually is secondary enterprises, beef and sheep being the main one, and almost every single one would have succession planning in place. Such as I like to say if Mrs. Smith in Croydon had to draw a picture of a dairy farm, she would be drawing a first milk farm. So there's very much a grazing focus, which is like the on average our farms are grazing for 6.4 months a year, and which is so grazed grass is hugely important. The commitment to regen, I suppose we started on this journey would be 4 years ago, and we identified actually as a real opportunity here for removals. Clearly, like every other dairy business, we need to look at reductions, which is like in emissions. But we really saw the heavy lifting needed to take place. I don't think we can get to net zero, which is as along with anybody else, just by reducing emissions. So we needed to look at removals as well. Certainly, Harry, I won't go through which is which is the regen principles, but we saw an awful lot of what our farmers were doing gave the opportunity to use regen agriculture and regen principles to actually to do some removals. And therefore, which is we started on a program to actually encourage our members who in lots of ways were doing some regen principles and practices already, just the terminology they weren't really aware of it. um, but we wanted to actually encourage them to move faster for sure. And I've actually we've done a I'll come on to talk about the work we've done to actually encourage that. Right at the beginning, we could start to model. There's some various work done throughout the world, actually, just showing what the opportunities were. But it was quite clear to me, and it's just and to the business that we really had to actually establish a baseline. Looked at loads of different options of actually for establishing that baseline, and I have to say is that she's the whole piece with Agricarbon, with the depth of the soil samples, bulk density, and the importance of that actually is I remember conversations early days with Annie and Helena, which is and really that for me of actually is made them the only option really is to take a good baseline. It means that she's there is a commitment. It takes a long time to notice these changes, and but she's without that robust actually is baseline, we didn't feel that that we'd necessarily be able to prove it in the future. Modeling's okay, but actually is some form of baselining. Hence why we went with Agricarbon to do that for us. And yeah, so we're 3 years in now, which is and certainly continue to use, so which is in certain areas where we've moved, which is we've recently acquired a business in Dorset, so we'd be basically doing some baselining down there to ensure that we've got an idea, which is what the differences are down in Dorset, because that's the other thing. It is very different, which is throughout all of those dots on the map. So Harry, I'll hand back to the team now, which is but that just gives us a bit of background to actually is first milk, and I'll be back later.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Mark. Now, when looking at all this work that we've done, it was very interesting to try and learn more, right? So I'll hand over to Sophia and to Helena to try and give you a taste of what the story that the data is actually revealing and is actually telling us.
Hi, Harry. So very glad to be here. So I'm here to talk more about what's the scientific point of view of the first mill case study, which as a scientist, it was a very exciting one. And that's because there's actually not much information on how management and land use affect soil carbon stocks across the UK in general, really, but here we're talking about the UK. So what we know as scientists is that there are many and sometimes very complex relationships between the physical, chemical, and biological properties of a soil and the ability of the soil to store carbon. So here on the right, we can see two pictures, which are a couple of examples. On top, there is a picture of a soil profile, meaning a slice of soil that goes down to depth. And we can see that there are two distinct color bands. The top one is much darker, and that means that it's richer in soil organic carbon, and it has also many more fine roots that you can see. And instead, the layer below is of a different color, and it has much fewer roots. So that depending on the soil type, this soil profile, so this distinction of bands will be different. So what we're really interested in considering are the changes that have happened as we go deeper into the soil. And we have to make sure that our measurements are able to capture these variations so that we have a whole picture of what's happening in the soil. The photo on the bottom instead is an example that I always show to farmers when I talk about the work that we have been doing at the University of Leeds about planting hedgerows for soil health. And from left to right, we can see that the soil, we can see some soil that has been sampled in an arable field, in a grassland field, and under a hedgerow. And these soil samples have been taken just a few meters apart, but you can see that the land use has a very big impact on the soil. So they're very different in terms of how compacted or how loose they are, so the density differs. And again, you can see that there is a gradient of color. That means that the soil carbon content differs as we move from one land use to another. So what we were really interested in was to work with these dairy farms with First Milk to understand how soil type, soil depth, and land use affect this baseline of carbon stocks and what is their potential for change. Helena, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm just going to add a little. Hi, folks. I'm going to sort of help this conversation along with a little bit of broadening the potential for this data set out a little bit. And what I wanted to add to this is, Sophia's going to talk about the detail of what it tells us, as she said, in soil type, depth, and land use. But I also wanted to highlight this survey has actually been extremely useful because it's allowed us to look at the practical aspects of monitoring across farms and across regions, and to be able to look at the number of soil cores you need to detect change, where sampling should be located, and all of this is feeding into the strategies that Agricarbon is using to design soil monitoring, but equally about how First Milk is going to go about doing the repeat and monitoring of these farms across years. Now, that's information to come, and you can talk to Agricarbon about how they do use this information, but now we'll get on to the detail of the science part, and I'm going to hand back to Sophia to tell you about the survey.
Thank you. Can you have the next slide, please? All right. So yeah, as I said, the First Mill case study was really exceptional for us. It's the most intensive soil carbon survey of dairy farm soils in the world. So when I received it, I was extremely happy. So what I received from Agricarbon and First Milk, we received soil sampling data and farm management data from 75 farms covering over 2,000 fields across over 8,000 hectares of land. And Agricarbon collected over 20,000 soil cores in these fields. And these represent over 63,000 individual samples, and we'll get to that in a second. But this data set is spatially explicit, and you can see here a map of what the distribution of the farms across the UK was. And the fact that there was a spatial component to it was very important because it allowed us to capture the variability of UK dairy landscapes in terms of climate, in terms of elevation, soil type, land use, and management. And so these are all very important. Oh, no, just
Sorry.
very important factors when we're talking about soil carbon. And we have been looking at them in details, but today we're going to focus on two very important categories, which are soil type and land use. Helena?
So, yeah, I'm just going to add to that. I also am extremely excited by this data set as someone who spent a lot of my academic career trying to understand change in soils using many different data sets from national surveys down to experimental. And the one thing that I wanted to highlight from this is actually the consistency in the methodology allows us to focus on what is the management changes, what are the land use changes, and not having to worry about what do the different methods do to these data. So we can park that issue, which has been what the problems we've had in the past with big data sets. And here we have one that's collected in a consistent way with the same analysis that allows us to say, right, the results we're seeing from land use and management, those are the signals we're seeing, and they're not about methodology. Thanks, guys. Sophia, on you go.
So I just wanted to give a quick refresher and a way to visualize what Harry was talking about earlier. So the way that the sampling is done is that several soil cores are taken from each field, and that allows us to capture this in-field variability of soil that Harry was talking about. So here's a picture of the soil core. And on average, Agricarbon took around 3 cores per hectare, which means around 11 cores per field in this data set. So the soil cores are quite deep. They go from the soil surface to 1 meter depth. And we're going to see in a couple of slides that actually soil is not often that deep in the UK. And in that case, we say that the soil core goes down to bedrock, which is the maximum depth of the soil in that point. So the soil profile that is sampled in the core is then sliced in 4 depth intervals, which are 0 to 15 centimeters, 15 to 30, 30 to 60, and then anything below 60 centimeters up to 1 meter depth. And for each sample, and this is really crucial, we have a measurement of bulk density. Bulk density is the density of the soil within the sample volume. And this is a very important variable to measure because soils can be more or less compacted, or for example, they can be more or less stony. That means that essentially the same volume of core does not necessarily contain the same amount of soil particles. And then for each sample, we get a measure of bulk density and a measure of carbon concentration or carbon content in the soil. And from these two variables, from these two measurements, we can calculate how much carbon is stored in the soil. And this is the definition of the carbon stock.
Yeah, so I'll pick it up from there. So your carbon stock is expressed in tons per hectare, which is produced through statistics either as a reflecting number of cores that you sample. But the bit I wanted to emphasize that I got here is, as you see, there's 4 depth have been sampled in the first milk data set, which is phenomenal. And it gives us a lot of information about how carbon is stored to depth in the soil, which Sophia will talk about shortly. I want to say at this point, and I want to explain why, but it is crucial that when you're doing carbon stock assessments, you measure at least 2 depths. We could maybe get into that in the discussion. But what I wanted to reflect back on is Harry mentioned the great potential of soils to store carbon. He talked about carbon as tons per CO2 equivalent. And I've also seen a question in the chat about that. I just wanted to reinforce, when you see the data following, it's in tons per hectare. If you want to think about it in tons of CO2 equivalent, then multiply it by 3.67. I'll hand over at that point.
Yeah, so as I said before, today we're focusing on 2 classifications, which are the land use and the soil types that we have in this first milk study. In terms of land use, we have 3 classes. We have arable fields, temporary grass lays that are inserted within an arable rotation, and these grass lays can last between 1 to 5 years. And then we have permanent grassland fields. Permanent grasslands here includes a wide range of management practices, because we have fields that might be periodically plowed and reseeded with intensive ryegrass cultivation, and then we have a whole spectrum of fields to much less intensively managed grassland. In terms of soil types instead, we have 4 soil types that are quite common across the whole of the UK. So these are mineral soils, and we have well-drained and fertile brown earths. We have poorly drained and heavy clays, very well-drained sandy loams, and heavy and fertile alluvial soils. And again here, there's some pictures to the right, and you can see that these are some of the examples of how the soil types differ, even to the naked eye, and how they're characterized by different coloration, different texture, and different layering, depending on the soil type that you're in.
So you might ask, why is it important for us to look at the role of different soil types in carbon removals? I actually don't really need to tell most farmers the reason for this. In short, we know that these different soils that you're seeing on the screen here all behave differently. We know that plants grow on them differently, and we know that the biology in these soils is different. So ultimately, it's going to reflect how soil carbon is actually removed and maintained in these soils. So it's an important factor for us to consider when we're looking at the potential for these soils to store carbon into the future.
So let's start looking at some of the results. So here in this plot, you can see how much soil type matters when we're talking about soil carbon stocks, and soil type plays a very big role. So we can see here the average field soil carbon stock across the different soil types, and you can see that it changes considerably depending on which soil type has been sampled. So for example, we can see that sandy loam soils are generally lower. They can store lower carbon stocks than heavy soils like alluvial soils. And this could be due to differences, as Helena just said, in the physical, in the chemical, in the biological characteristics of the soils, and it's something that cannot be changed by a farmer. What does this mean in practice is that each farmer has to work within the potential of the soils that are present in their farms. And importantly, it also means that farmers that are on different soil types cannot and should not be directly compared to each other.
Hi there. So we're really only touching on the soil type relationships in this webinar, but we wanted to introduce it to you because we know that soil's so important in managing our systems. There's a lot more work to be shown in here, and Sophia's actually working on this at the moment. So we're going to see work following this on the relationship between land use and soil types. But I wanted to bring out another aspect of this. Why is it important to know the soil types? So actually understanding what the stocks are in these different soil types enables us actually to improve our monitoring strategies, because these reflect the variability of what you see in a field, and understanding that variability in a field actually enables us to design monitoring more effectively. So there's a lot of more information we can get from knowing what soils are in these systems. But in the meantime, the starting point is, how does land use and management influence the soil carbon stocks? So I'm going to hand back to Sophia.
Right, so earlier I talked about how it's really important to look at the variability in carbon storage down the soil profile. And we received the data set from Agricarbon about these deep soil cores. And when we first look at the results of depth, we were quite surprised to see that actually the soils across the whole data set were relatively shallow, and that the average depth was around 50 centimeters. And this may not be a surprise to farmers at all, But as a scientist, we really did not have the evidence at such a big scale of this phenomenon. And this is why this type of really large data sets are so useful and so meaningful to us, so that we can attribute numbers to these components. So here you can see a bar plot, and what it's showing, it's the carbon content, so the carbon concentration of each depth interval in arable field, in temporary grasslands, and in permanent grassland. And you can see that the grassland throughout the soil profile has a higher carbon content than grasslands and arable fields. But you can also see that generally temporary grasslands have a higher carbon content than arable fields. Helena, is there something you would like to emphasize?
Yeah, so I'm
here?
just checking I'm back on mute. So I just wanted to emphasize, if you think of this as carbon content, the percent of carbon in the soil, it's reflecting how much organic matter is in the soil. So if you just multiply this roughly by 2, that gives you an idea of how much organic matter is in this soil. And we can clearly see that the organic matter is moving to depth in all of these land uses. Why might this be happening? And if you look at permanent grasslands, where you're actually getting more organic matter moving to depth, well, ultimately, we're looking at systems where we go from arable to lay to grassland, where we're actually decreasing the disturbance of the soil. So less ploughing, less tillage helps to retain more carbon. It enables the biology to build up. I mean, many of you will know that you actually see more earthworms when you don't disturb the soil, and they're acting to incorporate organic matter in the soil. It also enables the rooting systems to establish and push carbon to depth. And in turn, as you move from arable to grassland, there's more plant cover, increasing more biomass. So all of this is adding more carbon to the soil and adding it at depth. But I suppose what I'm trying to emphasize here, and it's a wee gentle reminder, that you can actually only increase carbon in soils if it comes from somewhere, whether it's plants taking it from the atmosphere, whether it's organic matter from livestock, whether it's actually longer rooting plants. So when you manage these soils, you've got to think about where's the carbon going to come from that we're getting into the soils. And ideally, we want it to come from the atmosphere and get it into depth. I'm going to hand back to Sophia.
Yes, I just wanted to show quickly what happens when you translate carbon content into carbon stock. So the pattern that we see of carbon content with depth is also shown in carbon stocks. So carbon stocks, as I mentioned before, essentially they correct the carbon content results by the density of soil particles in the volume of soil. And again, we can see that for each depth interval, permanent grassland holds the highest soil carbon stock, and that is true for the entire soil profile.
So I'm just going to pick up here. As you see, the carbon stock follows something similar to the organic matter content. You hold an awful lot more in the permanent grasslands at depth than you do in arable or lay. But the thing I really want you to take home from this slide is the fact that roughly 30% of the soil carbon stock is below 30 centimetres. So if you only sample to 30 centimetres, assuming your soil goes deeper, you are missing out a huge proportion of the stock. And more importantly, if you only measure to 30 centimetres, you've no idea what's happening below that when you go back to remeasure. And we know that carbon is moving to depth as we move with management changes. So first thing, Phil, I want you to take away from this is we really need to sample to depth if we're going to capture soil carbon stock changes. I'm going to hand back to Sophia here.
Yeah, so what we've seen so far is also that the permanent grassland holds a great deal, essentially more soil carbon stock than arable and lay systems. And so when it comes to carbon removals, the greatest amount of potential lies in transitioning land use from an intensive and an impoverished system like an arable system into something that instead has a longer term or even better permanent vegetation cover that can take carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. So this means including a temporary grassley within an arable rotation, or in a more extreme case, moving from arable to permanent grassland. What this plot shows is that is what the average difference in percentage is between different land uses in the first milk data set. So we can see that permanent grassland fields were on average 26% higher in soil organic carbon stock than arable fields, but also that lays were 13% higher than arable fields, which really shows the potential of introducing this type of grassley in an arable rotation for carbon removals.
Thanks, Sophia. So, as she's indicated, we can start to use these results to explore the potential for change in soil carbon stocks. So clearly moving from arable to grassland increases soil carbon stocks. There is a question about whether this is through using lays, which appears to increase carbon in a fairly short period of time, or whether transitioning to permanent grasslands, where the greatest increases are to be achieved over a longer time period. But I just wanted to put a little bit of, not word of caution, but something to keep in mind when you look at the lay systems, because you probably look at it and think, oh, that's fantastic. It is, it's great. But the thing to think about with lay systems is a lot of that soil carbon gain will be lost when arable cropping is reintroduced. So we need to start to think about how can we keep that carbon into the rotation. So do we have longer lays? Do we introduce something into the arable system that maintains the carbon we've gained through the lay? That's the sort of questions you need to start to think about it. Can we keep it in there? Because we know, as Sophia's going to show you shortly, when you go back to arable, you can lose a lot of it. But also, I wanted to explain here that there's also a lot of opportunity to gain carbon in permanent grasslands, and we'll come on to that. And Sophia's just going to illustrate this in the next slide.
Yeah. So we talked now about big land use changes for carbon removals. And of course, that is not always possible. The transition from one land use to another is a big change to the system. And in some cases, it just, of course, you need arable land. So what most of the regen ag practices instead focus on is changing the type of practice that is happening under the same land use. So what this graph shows you is the range in soil carbon stock that we observe in arable fields, in temporary grasslays, and in permanent grassland in the first milk data set. Might look overwhelming, but what you have to focus on is that is the spread of the point. So you can see that grasslays and permanent grassland fields have a much wider range in carbon stocks than arable fields. And this is due to the much wider range of agricultural practices that occur within these two land uses. So for example, in the case of grasslays, we can have longer or shorter lays, as Helena just mentioned, or lays with higher or lower species diversity. And instead, in permanent grassland, we can have very intensively managed, very frequently plowed and reseeded rye grassland, or you can have grasslands that are not as frequently plowed and reseeded and that show higher species diversity and they're not managed as intensively.
Hi there. So I'm just going to pick up on that. I'm going to reflect back on something we said earlier when we were talking about the soil type influence on soil carbon stocks. And although we're not showing these data here, I just want to reassure you when Sophia says that a lot of this variability is to do with the management, we're confident that it is. It's not just soil type variation in here. As I say, that's more results to follow. But one of the things we know is the management influence is important here. Now, I don't need to explain to you guys how difficult it is to obtain farm level or field level management information, especially historical data, which would enable a more detailed exploration of what's happening both within and between land uses. So I'm just going to say this is a work in progress. But what we do know is that first milk fields have moved to regenerative practices. So going forward, what we're now going to be able to do is reliably track how the soil carbon changes in relation to regenerative management practice after this system change and explore what this means in terms of not just the amount of change in carbon stock, but also the speed at which, or the time it takes to increase carbon stocks, because those two bits of information are actually vital missing links if we want to actually predict and demonstrate how regen will contribute to carbon removals. So I'm going to leave it at that point and hand back to Sophia.
May I just Sophia, 1 second, could I just jump in here? Because I've been asked, can you go back to the other slide? I've been asked quite a lot of times, can we still increase with permanent grasslands? Because obviously this is very present in dairy. And I think without knowing details, the short answer would be, if you see where the average are and what we have measured in the UK quite extensively, and where you see the opportunity of that maximum being the 350, the short answer would be most likely you still have opportunities to sequester more carbon, even in permanent grasslands, and obviously also with the others. So I just wanted to make sure that this is clear, that even in permanent grasslands, at the data that we see here, we see that there is still a lot of potential. And rightly, as you say, this then comes down to management practices.
Yeah, it really has to do with this gradient of intensity of management and moving instead more towards a regen ag practice-oriented system.
Thank you.
Right. So to wrap up what we said so far, what is the story that the data set is telling us? So first of all, we've seen that soil type is really important in managing soil carbon in dairy systems, and that the carbon stocks on a farm have to be understood in the context of the soil types that occur on that farm. That comparisons should not necessarily be made directly between different soil types. And we also seen that sampling soil depth is critical to monitor carbon stock changes, and this is where Agricarbon is really doing important work in capturing that variability at depth. And so the data set also shows that permanent grassland management maintains higher carbon stocks than arable land and grass lays, although grass lays do present an opportunity within an arable rotation to increase carbon stock, at least within a certain period of time. And then this big range in management practices that exist within especially permanent grassland management result in a very high variability of soil carbon stock, and that this means that this is where the carbon removal potential really lies for grasslands.
Thank you, Sophia. So while you read my key point to the end, I'm going to reflect back on two of Harry's questions at the beginning, where he posed the question, have permanent grasslands reached their limit? And I'm hoping we've demonstrated here from the data that we've got that clearly no, they haven't reached their limit. And there is obviously potential to increase carbon stocks in permanent grasslands. I also want to emphasise the fact that permanent grasslands already hold an awful lot of soil carbon, so we've got the real potential to maintain that and contribute to soil carbon removals by keeping that carbon there. And then he said, he asked, posed the question, how do we recognise the potential of soils to store more carbon? Well, I'm hoping we demonstrated there by having a baseline, and a good baseline, you can start to understand where the potential lies. So under different management systems, under different soils, under different regions. And then Harry posed a question about why do we rush? Why do we need to do this now? Well, I think there's many different dimensions to that question. I think, first of all, I hope we've demonstrated how a baseline can be used to inform where the potential lies, where you want to increase or where you might want to protect your carbon stores. But I think there's a more urgent issue here as well. We're all involved in how farm management is changing rapidly. And if we don't baseline now, we are going to have challenges in being able to include soil and soil carbon removals and reporting schemes as we go forward. Although there are issues with methodologies and protocols, etc., the baseline is a baseline. You can contribute it to any reporting scheme, whether that's for carbon credits or whether it's for Scope 3. So having that information now sets you in train for when your management changes. And the other thing I wanted to say was, from a scientific point of view, I really crucially want you guys to baseline, because we desperately need to have more information about how regen ag system changes actually influences soils. Without that, actually other aspects of MRV, whether that be modelling or whether that be remote sensing, won't actually be able to be applied in these systems. The direct measurement actually helps to unlock how we MRV agriculture going forward. So thank you, guys. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the science, and there's more to come as Sophia works her way through this massive data set. So thank you to her for all her hard efforts. And I'm not sure whether I'm handing to Mark or to Harry, but I'm going to hand over now.
That was perfect. Thank you both. That was amazing and a really informative summary at the end. Now let's hand over to Mark to highlight how are these kind of like breadth of information and data helping him and First Mill reach its goals. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harry, Helena, and Sophia as well. It's I've listened to about this subject for many a year, but every time, which is like I get encouraged with the opportunity, and so I've already gone through, which is like, you know, the location, etc., for the farms and the type of farms we're talking about. So for us, which is like, you know, and establishing a baseline was really important, but that means nothing actually unless you can affect change on farm. So in terms of, we could just move to the next slide, our approach was very much of actually, it's like, you know, that we're not scientists, actually, like within First Milk, which is like, I'd like to put us as we're enthusiastic amateurs, but which we know a bit about farming, and our farmers know an awful lot about farming. They don't get up each day and actually think, well, what can I do to actually sequester more carbon? Actually, like, you know, that's not in their you know, their vocabulary. So we need to actually make it real, and actually is like, you know, real for the farmers. And there's an awful lot of regen practices that are just good agronomic sense anyway. And so therefore, and the byproduct in a way is carbon sequestration. So what we did is actually is like, you know, literally this is just one event we had at one of our farms, and we got out there and we got in amongst it. Actually, is like, you know, when I mean that, actually is like, you know, we did which is like, you know, rainfall simulations showing the difference. Actually is like, you know, how you know, permanent pasture is you know, reacts to rainfall, you know, intensive rainfall, as opposed to, you know, tilled land, etc. We dug pits, such as like, you know, with JCBs in, dug pits to well, at least a meter if we could ever get down there. Some farms it's more difficult, as we've already identified. And when people could actually get in and out, such as like of a pit, how many times do we do that? Actually, is like, you know, dig a pit that deep and go down. People then realize that you can affect change that deep, which is like, you know, all the way down. You can see the activity of worm, but also roots down there as well. So if you've got that activity going on, that shows that there's real opportunities. I think in terms of, I've already talked about agricarbon and the, you know, that approach to actually is like, you know, establishing baselines, but we also needed to do the same for you know, what was happening above ground. That's just like, you know, from a biodiversity point of view. So we needed to actually, it's like, you know, capture data on the activity of which is like, you know, going on each farm, so that we've got a list of practices. So therefore, and be able to say and pass to people like Sophia and Helena and say, okay, this is what's been happening on those farms over the years, in order to be able to say we did this and that's what's happened. Actually, if you can imagine. And then really is actually is like, you know, the advice on farm, actually is like, you know, because what we're looking to do is actually, you know, is to change practices to improve soil health. That's just like, you know, so here there's which is like, you know, there's which is like, we're just demonstrating the benefit of getting more dung beetles. Such as like, we had a conference recently we hosted along with some others, such as like, with the importance of dung beetles. So it's again, it's trying to get it, looking at these things holistically. So Harry, if we could just move on to the next slide. The key part to this was the mapping tool. It's just like, that mapping tool, which is like, what we actually do with our members is that they're required basically is to which is like an encouraged to enter data on every single land parcel they basically have and own, which is like, that adds up to actually is like, hundreds of thousands of interventions. So we not only record crop, but actually is like, we will record all the activities such as how they graze, how often it's grazed, if it's rotational, it's actually is like, how long between each rotation, how many months of the year there's a living root, which is all the regen practices basically been which is that are included in the records for this. We should make it as easy as possible. It's just like, so obviously we've got links to the RPA, which is like, or the government mapping tools, but it does also require an awful lot of input from our members. I'm delighted to say, actually, is like, that to be fair, I would say admin is never a most favourite job for our members, which is like, that they do this. We do financially incentivize it because it is so important to actually have this data as well. Next slide, please, Harry. It's just like, so not only do we do which is like, so there's a desktop version, which most of the work, heavy lifting is done on the desktop where they're putting in their regen plans. But there's a mobile version as well, so it's like it's an app, and therefore the members can go out and do individual records in field. So therefore we encourage them to go and do test digs, such as like, do worm counts, look at their soil, which is like, so again, just to see which is like, what changes are being made. And a key point, which is like, just to the left there about the regen scores, which is like, so based on all of the interventions, we actually, as every farm receives a regen score, and those regen scores enable them to benchmark it themselves in 3 key areas, because soil carbon is hugely important, and the purpose of this webinar is there. But I must make a shout out that we mustn't forget the importance of looking at these things for benefiting biodiversity and then also water protection as well. So every single farm ends up with a regen score. And this year, for the first time, the part of the milk price is now diverted into that, so that effectively these points will actually, as I can make a difference to their return in terms of milk price. So there's further incentives to actually, as like, is to make changes towards a more regenerative approach to farming. If you can imagine, there were 700 farms, actually, is like, as far as this adds up to an awful lot of data. And actually, if we could move to the next slide, please, Harry. And we've got, which is like, around 85,000 hectares in the regen program. So it's 98% of our milk of actually is like is covered by this, which is like, for farmers who've done regen plans. But what we get coming out of it is actually is like, we're relatively small from a UK dairy perspective. We're around 6% of the UK dairy production, but we've got just 260,000 boundary trees. We've got 170,000 in-field trees. So that's not forestry. That would actually be silver pasture. So silver pasture, we believe, is something which is new and is coming in, but there's an awful lot going on there in the first place. Now we're further encouraging farmers to look more at that, which is like, but just from such a small sample, our members have got 5,000 kilometres of hedges. I mean, as far as I'm reliably informed, so which is that's all the way across Australia and from Land's End to John O'Groats. So that's just for a small amount of actually it's like of actually farms. Think of what all the UK dairy farms would add up to, let alone the beef and sheep. The amount of biodiversity that actually supports, but carbon sequestration is also supported by through these hedges, such as like and there's modelling done to actually like is to prove how much that is actually being able to do. I mean, in terms of the other data there is actually is that 261,000 interventions since 2022, we've actually as like increased the amount of activity, regen activity going on those farms by 60%, which is all credit to the members. It's almost becoming a bug, which is like they're getting, which is like some real pride in the amount of actually stuff they're doing. It's not just benefiting us to be able to talk about carbon sequestration and biodiversity increase, but it is also helping them actually like farm more efficiently. Rotational grazing, which we've actually like spent quite a lot of time. If we're looking at levers to pull, plant diversity and rotational grazing are more likely our two most important levers, and therefore we spent quite a lot of time encouraging our members to do more rotational grazing. And as you can see, is actually like there's been a massive increase year on year, and that's continuing. This was last year. This is still continuing this year again. Likewise with plant diversity. So in essence, actually, is like I think this work of actually is like I'm as impatient as anybody. Actually, is like I'm looking forward to going out and actually is like is doing some agricarbon measurements to actually is like demonstrate that what we believe is actually has happened, as actually is like is actually taking place. We are modelling it, and we use Farm Carbon Toolkit, which is like to model all of this work. Actually, like so, those 261,000 interventions last year, which is like we believe, which is like using the modelling from Farm Carbon Toolkit, we had a target of sequestering 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent by 2025 from our members. We got very close last year. We reckon it was over 99,000 tonnes, so which is like of CO2 being sequestered by our members in 2022, of which is like in 2023 we know we'll be above our 100,000 target. Effectively, is actually 2 years ahead of time. All thanks to the actions of our members. Basically, is actually is like so. There is real progress that is like being made, and as I say, it's getting farmers to actually change their practices that is going to be making the difference. In answer to I think some questions there, is permanent grassland, is there still opportunity? Well, certainly from all the work I've seen, and actually is like I see a gentleman on the call here, which is like Mr. Gilliland, which is like would also agrees that permanent pasture still has the opportunity to increase of actually carbon sequestration. It doesn't top out. In essence, we'll be growing soil, actually, is like so in that process. So there's real opportunities. Final slide from me, which is like so just to show the progress, actually is like that the members have made since 2022. So these scores are the averages for our members in biodiversity, carbon, and water. So you can see there's a quite phenomenal increases in regen scores, and now it's actually like the members are being rewarded for that progress, which is like in their milk price. But it's also is like demonstrating what I truly believe is that dairy farming done well can be part of the climate solution. Thank you very much.
That was that was amazing. Thank you very much, Mark. And I want to thank both you and First Milk for being part of this exciting project for us, plus the University of Leeds for their amazing work that they did with the data. Now, I want to thank all the speakers so far. I will now stop sharing and I will open the floor for questions. Now, I see that that this is really exciting. There's so many questions, and they all look very interesting. So let's start with a bit more on the scientific side. So first question would be, sorry, what is the percentage error of our organic carbon analysis, and does it cover the increase in organic carbon that can be reasonably expected in a soil after 5 years of change of practices? Now, this is a really good question, and it actually reveals a lot of the fact that there are a lot of layers. So yes, there is a percentage of error in the analysis, but it's not only there, right? So we need to be, and the process that we've built is acknowledges the every step of the way we need to reduce the uncertainty. So yes, there's a percentage of error in the lab that includes, the error in the analysis or the homogenization error, but we need to acknowledge that there is work that we are doing to reduce the uncertainty, both in how we sample, so the actual work that we do on the field, and the actual work that we do on coming up with the sampling design. So we have the numbers, right? And we're very happy. We're very happy to share. But we need to acknowledge that there is a process, and on every step we're trying to reduce the uncertainty. Now we're not using any models, so that would add another layer of uncertainty. And then on the question of if this covers the increase in organic carbon that can be expected after 5 years, yes. What we're trying to do is we're trying to design the sampling exercise, so we are able to capture there's this notion of a minimum detectable difference. So we design the sampling process to have just enough samples in order to be able to prove with, is it 90% confidence, 95% confidence that these changes are real. There was another question on the scientific side. If does the result depend on the time of the year the sample is taken? I don't know if Helena, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, hi guys. I think I probably answered some of this in the chat when I said, yes, it can do, without a doubt. And that's why if you are needing some sleep, you can always read the soil carbon methodology protocols. They're guaranteed to give you a good night's sleep. But actually in those, what they clearly say is you need to be careful about when you sample and when you go back to sample. So you need to think about your management practices. So you don't go in straight after someone's had a whole load of farmyard manure. You wait a bit of time until after it's done. If it's extremely dry and droughty, and the soil is hard, you need to think about your methodology in terms of, are you going to sample to the same depths when you come back again? That's one of the benefits, I must say, about sampling to depth. The deeper you go, the less influence you're going to have if you're going back when it's droughty, and then the next time you go back and it's rainy, particularly if you go to bedrock, as Sophie has pointed out. So yes, it is important, but there are ways to account for that in the sampling methodologies. I'll hand back to you, Harry.
Perfect, thank you. Now you answered the question when it comes to how can we actually go from soil organic carbon to CO2 equivalent. So that's perfect. Then there's another interesting question about that states the fact that no-till practices generally increases carbon in the top 5 to 10 centimeters of soil, but can also reduce the amount of soil carbon stored at greater depths. So it would be interesting to hear do you have any information or our opinion on the carbon plan referred as a carbon redistribution effect?
For anybody who hasn't had a chance to look at the carbon plan redistribution effect article because they've been speaking, I had a look. So this question I think came from Richard. The short answer is I don't know that many studies have been carried out looking with large sample numbers to depth, and it's one of the reasons that Sophia and Helena have done this work for grasslands, but obviously it's very, very important that we do similar studies to look at conventional farming practices in crops and regenerative practices in crops. Whenever I've asked the question about the data behind assumptions on changes in carbon to depth in other systems, I often find that either they are modeled, which means that they're being derived from assumptions, or they're based on very small amounts of data. So my response to that is, I don't think we know very well, and I think that's exactly the kind of thing that the data that Agricarbon is aggregating will allow us to feed back to the industry. And it's actually that specific question about carbon changes over depth is one of the ones on our agenda for another research program, probably looking globally. Sorry, I say globally, I mean Europe and North America, to look at a number of different soil types and soil systems in quite different geographic regions as well, so that we get some of those drier, droutier, warmer climates and soils that are mentioned in the Carbon Plan article in North America. Helena, I'm sure, has got more to add.
I'm going to mention something that everybody usually cringes when I mention this, but I think it's also important to remember at this point that when you go back to repeat your sampling, there's something called equivalent soil mass, which if you read the literature to do with no-till and min-till results in the States is something that they use to actually look at this effect of how depth influences stock. So I'm just going to mention and say there are ways of looking at the data that allow us to determine whether where the stock is really distributed, whether is it real gain or a real loss. Min-till may increase it, may decrease it. It's not always a straightforward answer there. What I will say is this comes back to what I said earlier on about you have to have 2 depth sample to be able to apply that technique. So that is why it's critical. If you want to know more about the reasons for that, the scientific reasons, we can follow on after this call. But that's the thing that's critical in this. Whether it's min-till or anything else, we need to have 2 depths to be convinced that any changes we see are real. Sorry, Annie. Back to you, Harry.
That was perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks for this. Another question, a bit on a more general side of things, and we have been in various stakeholder groups. Do we see any efforts to standardize MRV systems and direct soil measurements, and how are the different industry leaders and policymakers advancing on that front? Annie, do you have, yeah?
Yeah, really good question. I suspect John could add a lot to this. The short answer from me is there are 3 key areas where we keep a close eye on how protocols and standards and regulations developing. One is voluntary carbon market. So if any of you have come across Vera, they have a protocol which allows carbon farming to produce carbon offsets. The second is what we mentioned in the call earlier as scope 3. What that means is food and beverage companies who are looking at net zero through their supply chain, and obviously farming is part of their supply chain, and they are looking to comply with equivalent standards to the kind of things that Vera's produced for the voluntary carbon market. And the one that most of you probably will have heard of is the greenhouse gas protocol for land sector removals guidance. I can never remember quite the acronym. And then there are various state level regulatory standards that are beginning to be discussed in Europe and in North America. So we do keep a close eye on those. Yes, they are looking, the very short answer would be yes, they're looking to standardize where possible, particularly around the measurement part, so that when you talk about 1 ton of carbon dioxide being removed into becoming a part of the organic carbon in the soil, you're talking about the same metrics. So it's almost like a common currency of 1 ton of carbon, regardless of whether it's in the voluntary carbon market or a regulated market or something else, is equal to another ton, the same ton of carbon in a different scheme. And that's one of the key things that we held as a really important principle behind what we're doing, is to allow that to happen. They're not quite there yet, and the rules around how you can use carbon removals in various carbon accounting claims or marketing or anything else differs by the different systems. But the key piece for harmonization that's most important is, are we talking about a ton of carbon in one scheme and another? John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think since John is not part of the official Agricarbon team, he actually cannot unmute himself, so somebody would need to unmute him. But maybe we would need to tell who is actually John and why is he able to or asked to say something. I'm not sure. Can you try again, John?
Rob, if you can unmute John.
I think I already did. So if you try again, John, to unmute yourself.
So sorry, John Gilliland. I'm an advisor to AHDB and QMS, but someone who's been running ArcZero, which is a group of farms going on a journey to net zero. This is somewhere that I've been particularly passionate about, is how you measure change of carbon stocks, whether it's below ground, whether it's above ground. We have used Agricarbon quite intensively, and so we have good experience of what Agricarbon has done. I am just back from Australia, where I've also been working with Carbon Link and looking at the Australian Clean Energy Regulator and their Australian Carbon Credit Unit system, where they have now converged onto one methodology for the statutory scheme in Australia. A lot of what we've been shared today, they are repeating. Where they are probably moving ahead, and actually Helena has flagged it up, and that is around then soil mass equivalence. Is this issue, soil organic carbon actually is lighter than clay, sand and silt, and if you build up more soil organic carbon, your bulk density diminishes over time. So, I would encourage people to look at Australia as well as North America, and not to ignore what's going on in the European Union. There is now trilogue approval to get a single certification framework for carbon removals from the land-based sector, something we in the UK should be very aware of, because we both supply and import from the European Union. And as land managers in the UK, we need to be acutely aware what our neighbours, stroke competitors, stroke customers are doing.
That was amazing, John. Thank you. That was very, very insightful. Thank you for that. Now, moving on to a bit more general questions as well. So looking at food and drink businesses, and as Mark pointed out, they can pull a few levers to remove or reduce emissions within the supply chain. So there's two questions around it. First, is it possible to get an estimate of what percentage could potentially be reduced via soil carbon sequestration? So get an estimate on the kind of like of the capacity and grasp the level of the opportunity. And the next question is, what else can businesses do to prepare themselves in advance of initiating a baseline? So, Mark, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's just like, in terms of the overall quantum, I don't have the stats on that, if I'm perfectly honest with you, Harry, is in all the sectors. But I think the point I was making, actually, is like, we're a relatively small part of the UK agriculture, and therefore we see it as being significant from a standing start. Sequestering, which is significant amounts. And that's not it. We set the target of 100,000 tons, which is like, we believe we can more than triple that, which is like, which will, our removals are going to be, very significant for our business, for certain. In terms of I think you definitely have to establish a baseline. That's like to be able to demonstrate it. But for any food business, I think you also, key to all of this is to then make changes to actually farming practices in order to be able to deliver, which is like, these reductions as well. That's just, and that's I would imagine every single food business is looking to do that. I think it's a lot easier to look at of actually as reductions. And there are a lot of things out there we can start to talk about, and which is be able to do that. Increasing efficiency, which is more likely the easiest one to do. But also, it's just we haven't gone down anything as far as looking at quick fixes in terms of reducing methane production from cows, etc. At the moment, which is we see we're putting all of our attention actually into removals at the moment. So engage with the supply base, which is and therefore get back to farm level, would be my which is number one, which is recommendation.
No, that was perfect, and it's really interesting the fact that you are actually focused in removals, and you understand the urgency of getting a good baseline and acting then to manage carbon removals across the supply chain as well. So that was really helpful. Annie, do you want to add something?
I did a quick Google, and according to the EU Field Fork article back in 2023, global food system emissions estimated to be 15.8 gigatons of CO2 per year. And the figure Harry gave at the start was that sequestration into soils could be between, was it 2.5 to 8 gigatons? So 2.5 to 8 gigatons against global emissions of 15.8 across the whole food system. I can put the reference in the chat. It's not come from us directly, but there you go. That's the power of Google.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Annie, for this. Also, I've seen that I've noticed somebody. Few you have your hands up. Can you please put your questions in the Q&A? Can you write it down, and we'll just put it on the chat, and we'll try to answer it now. Another question for either Sophia or Helena. It has to do with, can you please explain a bit more why the carbon is actually moving into depth?
Do you want me to grab a go, Sophia, or do you want to have a go?
Go for it. It's one of your favorite topics.
So ultimately, naturally, a soil will move carbon to depth. If it's a natural soil, it's undisturbed, it's got no agriculture, whatever, the carbon will naturally move to depth. And why will it do that? Because you have a system which takes carbon from plants, might be living plants that then have roots that go to depth, and they put carbon exudate substances into soil at the depth of the rooting system. And it's key here, if you're moving from arable systems to permanent grassland systems, for an example, what you have in the permanent grassland is roots that are there all year round, a variety of roots at different depths, and the ability for them to put carbon into depth. You then have the secret sauce to this bit, which is a more I'm trying to think well-formed, that's probably the worst language, but effectively what you have is a biological system that's there, it's sustained, it operates around that grassland system, it captures that carbon, whether it's from the roots or whether it's from decomposing plant material or whether it's dung, and it takes it into the soil system and it cycles it. And what we know is, if a soil is undisturbed, then the biology moves to depth. So you think about this, earthworms are the classic of this. You've got different groups of earthworms. Some of them live at the top of the soil and they take in the organic matter from the top of the soil. You've then got other earthworms that actually drill down into the soil to depth and take organic matter with them. I don't know if you've ever dug a soil pit and you can actually find them often at meters depth. And actually, if you're really careful with a microscope or an eyeglass, you can actually see the organic matter they pull to depth. So it's all about, can you keep the soil relatively undisturbed? Can you get roots to depth? And can you make sure you add carbon to the soil in a system? It may be decomposing plant material, it may be dung, it may be the diversity of different plants you've got capturing carbon in different ways from the atmosphere. I hope that helps to answer your question.
That was really good. Thank you very much, Helena. Now, Another really good question, and it kind of like it looks at this holistically, right? So given that over 70%, I think that's the recent statistic, 70% of UK agricultural land is at critical levels for soil nutrient imbalances, right? And we were mentioning on how soil stores carbon through photosynthesis and canopy development above ground, and therefore increasing biomass below ground. Are there any data or research that you, Sophia or Helena, are aware, focusing on correcting these imbalances to capture more carbon? And the other thing is improvements in pasture forage bring this holistic view in. So improvements in pasture forage, improvements in crop, improves nutrition and aids digestibility and helps lower methane levels from livestock. So are you aware of any data supporting this or any research being done at the moment?
So do you want to talk about the work that you're doing? Actually, it's interesting. This relates partly to probably what you're doing at Aarhus as well. So
yeah, so as Harry mentioned, I was at the University of Leeds for almost a decade, and I have recently moved to Aarhus University in Denmark, and I'm currently working on a European project. So it's a Soil Mission Horizon project that is looking into producing a standardized and harmonized MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification system for Europe. So there are definitely efforts that are being made in terms of standardizing these methodologies. I think this was also a question from earlier, and so the project that I'm working with at the moment focuses specifically on modeling soil carbon stock, because that's the expertise that we have within the project. However, one of the most interesting aspects for me coming from this measuring background instead is that we have also established that it's essential to measure a baseline independently to what land use you're in. You really want to extensively measure that land use so that you're able to know where you're starting from if you ever want to measure or even estimate a difference. Sorry, I think I sidetracked a bit. What was the question originally, Harry?
So sorry, it was a bit on if you're aware on any data or are you doing any research focusing on correcting the nutrient imbalances to capture more carbon, and any improvements in pasture forage and crop that leads to improvements in nutrition that would aid the digestibility to lower methane levels from livestock.
So maybe while Sophia thinks about that, I'm going to follow because that's a massive question.
It is,
right?
it is, yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll start with the first part of it and about nutrient imbalances. I think it's important to actually emphasize what's come up here. It is key to managing and storing carbon is the right nutrient balances and the right levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and other things in the soil. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges actually going forward, is finding that balance by which we have enough biomass coming off for our productivity, but that is not adversely influencing our capacity to store carbons. And there's a lot of literature out there that looks at the relationship between available nitrogen and storing carbon. It's well established. So that's this shift in balance between how much inorganic fertilizer we're applying and how much carbon we're storing. It's not an easy answer, I'll be honest with you. There's some modelling work on it. There are experiments at it. There's quite a bit in the scientific literature. But it is going to be a challenge. But I think it's not just a soil carbon challenge. I think it's more of a wider agronomic challenge for farmers in terms of more judicious use of inorganic fertilizer, which is actually then going to benefit carbon storage. So, sorry, it's a very long-winded way to answer your question. Yes, there are scientific answers to this, but actually I think it's a wider question in terms of the agronomy and how that's maintained, how we maintain productivity in regen systems. I think that's the first big question there. Sorry. Sophia, do you want to follow up? Is there anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, I can just say briefly now my experience here being in Denmark, which is a system that is extremely focused on productivity, and there are entire research departments that are focusing on trying to figure out how to balance nitrogen need and loss of nitrogen to the environment with carbon stock accumulation. And it's a very complex. There's no easy answer, and yeah, usually the issue is always spatial variability. So anything that captures spatial variability of this process is a step in the right direction, in my opinion.
Thank you.
That was perfect. Thank you. I know it was a it was a bit of an overwhelming question within a question, but no, that you did an amazing job. So I have one question. I know it's one of Annie's favorite questions. So it is about compositing samples and the effects and what do we think about it. So I'll let Annie handle this one.
Thanks, Harry. So there are a small number of things to say about this. I think compositing has come about historically from conventional soil testing, where the price of the lab analysis is very expensive. So compositing is a way of reducing the cost by reducing the number of lab analyses that you have to do. This was the very first starting point for what Agricarbon does differently. So as Harry's already talked about at the beginning, we've created machinery that means that we reduce the lab analysis piece of cost down to a really low amount, so that you don't have to compromise the number of samples that you want. So if you want to measure 20 samples across a field, that's fine. You don't have to, you're not forced into a situation where you have to composite them, because actually you can only afford one composite to be sent to the lab. The problem with compositing in top of my mind is twofold. Helena may add something. The first is that compositing samples together is really tricky to get perfect. So if you imagine, let's say you took 15 samples across the field, actually mixing those together in a way that means that you get a really, really good homogenization. And if you were to then take, let's say, 15 separate subsamples from that mix, they would all come out with the same carbon number, is highly, highly unlikely. And typically compositing is done in the field, in a bucket. And so in reality, it's a completely unquantified piece of uncertainty. If you go back to the question at the start about error, this is one of the pieces where what we do is to remove that error. We know it's likely to be huge because we know how difficult it is to mix in a bucket something that can be like chewing gum clay with something that could be like, I don't know, sponge cake or uncooked pastry. And the idea of trying to mix them perfectly is unrealistic. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to eliminate compositing from the way that we've designed things. The second is equally important, if not more important, is that when you composite, you only send one sample to a lab. That sample gives you one result. As Harry described earlier today, the number of results you get determines how difficult or easy it is to be confident about the change you're measuring over time. Harry introduced the term minimum detectable difference. We can provide a technical paper on that for anybody who wants to understand it in more detail. The really simple answer is that a smaller minimum detectable difference gives you a more sensitive test for being able to measure small change. So you want a small minimum detectable difference. The more samples you have, or the more sample number, the number of results you have in your test set, the smaller that minimum detectable difference. So large number of samples equals small minimum detectable difference equals good measurement that can detect even small changes. That's the other reason we don't composite, because if you take, let's say, 15 soil cores in a field, or even fewer, if you take 6, we would send all 6 to our processing facility, and that gives you 6 data points. If you composite, you only get 1 data point. we've actually done some work looking at fields where we've taken the 6 data points or 15 data points, and we've said, what would be the impact on the ability to measure change if you had perfectly composited all of those cores, but you only got one lab result? And the impact is that in order to measure change in 5 years with Agricarbon's method, you would have to wait over 20 years to be able to detect the change if you composited samples and then only had one result for each batch of, say, 15 samples put into a composite. Now, that's very simplistic, and that was one particular large-scale study with about 100 fields. But that's the kind of impact that compositing can have. You have too few results, and you cannot detect change with statistical certainty until that change is massive, and you might have to wait 20 years to have achieved that kind of change. Anybody from the team want to add anything to clarify what I've just said?
No, can I just add one little thing? Well, it's just a little thing. So I think there's quite an important part that we miss out when we think about compositing. So the vast majority of compositing looks at compositing to measure soil carbon content. And actually the bit that's the missing part is bulk density. And historically, as soil scientists, we've gone out in a field and we've really not, well, we've taken 1 or 2 bulk density samples, and we might take them to 2 depths, but we generally don't. This methodology, doing discrete samples in a core, allows you to measure bulk density for the same sample that you're getting the SOC % for. And to me, as a scientist, that gives us a much more robust, reliable measurement of stock per sample, per depth, per field. The thing it does that we haven't been able to do today is give us a measurement uncertainty on the bulk density at each depth. And that is critical for the measurement of stock. Now, some might come back to me and say about equivalent soil mass. It's also critical to the measurement of soil mass. So it is vitally important that we have discrete samples where we measure the 2 key components of stock. Third, if you want to add math, on each sample. That way we know that we've got the measurement error reflected properly. And to me, that's a major advancement. And anyone that's tried to do bulk density in the field knows how hard it is to do. So being able to get that for every depth layer is a major advance. I'm going to leave it there before I get too excited.
I was just going to say, thanks, Helena. One really small thing. It would actually cost us more to do compositing because the time it would take to mix the samples in the field would actually introduce greater cost than analysing all of the samples individually. So it's technically and scientifically better, and it's also lower cost. Back to you, Harry.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Now there's another question, and I think it focuses a bit more on the next step when it comes to the work with the data that we already have. So, are there any cultivation practices recorded, and have we tried to, or are we going to try to correlate with carbon and carbon chain? So, trying to map specific practices to the carbon profiles. Is there any? Do you have any thoughts, Sophia? Or
yeah, so this is something that is upcoming. Essentially, what Mark is doing now, they're collecting all of this information at the field scale about what farmers have been doing since Agricarbon initially measured the soil, and then all this wealth of information will be used once remeasuring occurs, and then that will allow us to attribute a change to a particular set of practices, and then we can actually start looking into the details of what specific region ag practices are most beneficial in certain settings.
Harry, can I just come in on that as well? This is, you know, the some of the work when we've gone back to farmers with their Agricarbon results and discuss them. When you actually sit down and you go, there's your highest field and there's your lowest field, and just talk us through, actually, it's like, you know, what was the difference? And it's really great if you can get to a 2 or 3 generations sat around a table. And that's just like, because it's often as actually like, it's practices that have, go back decades, such as like that will have a massive influence. Neighboring fields, and you say your highest is there and your next field of actually is like, obviously with the enclosure of actually where the hedges are is arbitrary. But as far as this field is never never been ploughed, which is like in living memory would be your highest, and the lowest is actually, well, that's a field that's been ploughed actually every single year. So there's an awful lot to be gained from that. What that enables us to do is that in any population you'll have early adopters, so that people who've actually got on the journey early on, which is like on regen, and made some significant changes. And it may not be the whole farm we can go back to, but it's certain fields whereby practices have changed, and therefore we will be able to look at people who've moved from ploughing every year to actually is like either min-till or no-till, and actually just be able to do that. So yeah, it just kind of backs up the need to to have this data. So it's starting point, baseline, then the practices, and then be able to see what they're the best ones will be the ones that pull the biggest levers. So move from set stock into rotational grazing and incorporated lots of veggies like plant diversity. So we're getting those veggies like roots down deep, exuding the sugars to increase the soil. Those are the places we're going to be looking at, which is like for our biggest wins.
That was very helpful. Yeah, very insightful, Mark. Thank you very much. Now, there was a question about the frequency of testing, and the main point around it is that these are these are biophysical processes, and they take time, and we need to be aware of the minimum number of samples that we need to detect the change, as we have explained. So it's not something that you would do every year especially when trying to measure soil carbon stocks. Most of the projects we're working with, and it fits with main methodologies and frameworks, would be 5 years or 10 years. So we're talking about multi-year projects, and it's very interesting to try and understand how to keep everybody engaged and everybody fully focused when it comes to that. So it can be challenging, but our experience makes it easy, especially when it comes to the specifics. Another question was around the cost. So how much it will cost farmers to carry out these routine monitoring, and what is the cost per hectare. So it depends. That's our favorite phrase, right? So this is what I spend most of my time doing, trying to look at each project and try to give a tailored response to that. Now, there's plenty of levers to try and look at the cost benefit analysis for the farmers and for operations. The main thing to consider here is that our process makes it very, very simple, right? So it makes it easy. And when it comes to the pricing, yes, the bigger the better. So you could have from let's say range, you bring in a lot of farms together, or you bring a lot of hectares together across a portfolio, and then you have a very attractive price per hectare. But the main thing to remember is that it is attractive for any side, to be honest, and we are focusing on the tailored process and tailored results. I don't know if Annie, do you want to add anything on this one, or you added on the chat?
I'll just add to it real quick.
Perfect.
So I think you added, so there is very important to keep in mind that the bigger the project, the more interesting the price becomes. But there is something to be said that we do work specifically in the UK also with a lot of single farms. What we would encourage is always to look into, for example, would you want to cluster within more farms or go to your dairy company? So, for example, within First Milk, they've done some great work, and then that makes a lot more sense to really also driving change at a higher level. So please reach out to us. We can give you a bit more detailed answers, but specifically for really large projects, we have seen prices that would be below 20 to 30 pounds per hectare. So that is very, very interesting in terms of looking into large scale projects. And we're very happy to engage on all levels. But I think, yeah, it's something that can be done in different sizes. And we've seen many farmers also joining, for example, also some of the people that we work with that would be, for example, creating carbon credit schemes. So that can be very interesting as well. But I think it's really about, driving this at a higher level, ideally. Yes, Annie.
Given that I know we have some people here from Sydney and possibly some people from North America, I think it's worth mentioning that the figure Eileen's talking about is particularly thinking about Europe, where you've got very small fields and farms are typically, let's say, for example, 20 to 50 fields, and each field might be 5 to 10 hectares in size or even smaller. The work that we're doing at the moment in North America, we're not yet operating in Australia, but in North America, where the land is much more homogeneous and the farms and field sizes are on a completely different scale, so too are the measurement costs. So the scaling effect that Eileen's mentioned is a whole order of magnitude different when you start looking at the large farms in North America and Australia. So that at that point, we're down to the lower than $5 per, and I'm thinking American dollars here. I know you're Australian dollars different, but that's when you start to get down to the below $5 a hectare type pricing, which is incredibly valuable for scaling. And we've mentioned a little bit about modelling and the challenges with modelling and satellite imagery and so on. That becomes the kind of scale where the cost of direct measurement, which gives you that confident measurement of change, becomes lower than the cost of other technologies which are introducing a great deal more uncertainty into the process. So it becomes a very kind of interesting cost value equation for direct measurement at that sort of scale as well. Sorry, I'll stop there.
That was perfect. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Annie. So I think, conscious of the time, I think it's time to start wrapping this up. So 3 things I want to bring in, thinking back on the initial question. So and the initial key points of this webinar, how to net zero in dairy carbon, how to get there faster by looking at carbon removals. I think we established that yes, permanent pastures can sequester additional carbon, and there's a lot to it. It is easy to do. Here at Agricarbon, we do most of the work for you, and there is a need to establish a baseline now and look at the carbon removals now. So I want to thank all of our speakers today. I want to thank you, Mark, Elena, Sophia, Annie. Do you want to add something, or sorry, I think you got the. Oh, sorry, you have the hand up. So thank you. No worries. Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, John, for stepping in. That was very, very helpful. And thank you, Rob, for managing everything in the questions and putting this together. So most of all, thank you everybody for joining this today. I hope you learned something, and please do reach out to us to help you with your carbon measurement needs. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day, everybody. Thanks.